The year was 1305. London stirred as it always did. Bustling merchants shouting their prices, carts creaking under weight, hooves tapping out a chaotic rhythm across the stone roads. But on one particular August morning, something darker churned in the city's air. It wasn't the familiar hum of commerce. No, it was something far more primal, the swelling murmur of thousands flocking not for market or fair, but to see a man die in a way few would ever forget. The man at the centre of this bloodthirsty crowd's obsession was William Wallace, a Scottish warrior who had stood against England, dared to lead his people against foreign dominance, and paid dearly for that defiance. What unfolded on that day wasn't just a death sentence carried out. It was a deliberate display of state-sponsored savagery. Wallace wasn't merely killed. He was unravelled, piece by piece, in front of an audience meant to learn a single, brutal lesson. No rebellion would go unpunished. Modern retellings have dulled the blade of this memory. Films have made Wallace a stoic icon, a tragic hero who died with a noble scream and eyes full of defiance. But the truth was uglier. King Edward I, nicknamed Longshanks for his imposing frame, had no intention of letting Wallace die with dignity. This execution wasn't justice. It was a performance of power, crafted to traumatise Scotland and make an example of a man whose only true crime was refusing to bow. The chosen method was reserved for those labelled the worst of the worst, traitors. Hanging, drawing and quartering wasn't just execution. It was annihilation. It stripped a person of identity, dignity and bodily integrity. Each phase of it was meant to communicate something, a message to the victim, the spectators, and generations to come. This was England's way of planting a flag in someone's memory. It said, "Defy us, and this will be your end." To truly comprehend what happened to Wallace that day, we need to understand the world he came from. Late medieval Scotland was a land in flux. It wasn't yet the defined nation we think of today. Allegiances shifted constantly, often driven more by the instinct to survive than by any national pride. The Scottish Wars of Independence had erupted out of dynastic confusion, chaos that Edward saw as an opportunity to drag Scotland fully into the English fold. To him, the northern lands weren't sovereign. They were stubborn territories refusing to fall in line. Wallace rose from obscurity not as a prince or general, but as a man deeply wronged. He came from a modest lineage, not born into grandeur, but into the weight of grief and anger. His family had suffered under occupation. His homeland was shackled. So when he rallied men at Stirling Bridge in 1297, it wasn't out of ambition. It was out of fury and vision. That battle, his victory, was more than military. It was symbolic. It showed that the seemingly unstoppable English forces could be defeated, and that freedom wasn't just a fantasy whispered in forests and glens. But Edward was no fool, and certainly not lenient. He had crushed Welsh resistance with an iron hand and expelled Jewish communities from England altogether. He believed rebellion was like a spark. Left alone, it could ignite an inferno. Wallace, in Edward's mind, had to become a warning, not only to Scots, but to anyone across the Isles thinking of rebellion. The king would not just erase Wallace, he would redefine him as a cautionary tale. By 1305, much of the Scottish nobility had bent the knee to Edward. The will to fight had been beaten out of many, or replaced by the cold logic of survival. Wallace, still resisting, had become a problem, not only for England, but also for those Scots who had chosen submission. His refusal to yield embarrassed them. His freedom was a thorn. His capture was no longer just a military aim, it was politically necessary. Catching Wallace wasn't simple. He'd become a ghost, flitting between safe houses and sympathetic clans. Edward's administration responded with a dragnet of spies, double agents and informants. They spread gold where threats failed, and over time Wallace's circle shrank. Those who had once stood with him began to weigh their chances. Many decided that silence or betrayal was safer than loyalty. The end came, as it often does, from within. In August, Wallace was seized near Glasgow. It's likely he was turned over by Sir John Menteith, a fellow Scot who had pledged allegiance to the English crown. Historians still argue the details, but the fact remains: Wallace fell not on a battlefield, but in the web of treachery. His arrival in English custody was greeted with cheers in London. Yet for Edward, The true prize wasn't the capture. It was what came next. The trek from Scotland to the English capital wasn't merely transport. It was humiliation on wheels. Bound in chains, Wallace was paraded through town after town, displayed like a defeated beast. This wasn't just about moving a prisoner, it was about breaking a legend. The man who had defied England was reduced to a spectacle, dragged before gawking villagers who had heard stories of the fierce Scot and now watched him beaten and caged. By the time he reached London, Wallace had already endured weeks of degradation. And still, the worst had yet to come. His trial was not a real trial, not in any honest sense. It took place in Westminster Hall on August 23rd, under the glare of a crown already set on the outcome. The charges were extensive: treason, murder, arson, and sacrilege among them. The proceedings were in Latin, a tongue Wallace likely didn't know. Not that it mattered. This wasn't a courtroom, it was a stage, and Wallace was the condemned actor with no lines to deliver. When given the chance to speak, he reportedly stated that he couldn't be guilty of betraying Edward, since he had never recognised him as king. That defiance, spoken plainly, sealed his fate. Of course, the verdict had been written long before he entered the room. Each accusation served a purpose. Treason justified the barbaric punishment. The other charges, murder of English troops, attacks on clergy, recast him as a villain, not a freedom fighter. Edward needed Wallace painted as a criminal, not a patriot, and so the legal system became a blade disguised as parchment. Then came the sentence. Delivered with pomp, it laid out Wallace's final path. He would be dragged through the streets, then hanged, but not until dead. He would be cut open while still alive, his insides removed and burned before him. His head would be severed, his corpse dismembered, each act choreographed for pain, for symbolism, for domination. It wasn't death, it was erasure. That August morning in London dawned warm, the sky mockingly serene. The streets filled early. Wooden platforms had been set up along the route. Food vendors worked the crowds. Children were lifted onto shoulders. People jostled for a clear view, not of justice, but of carnage. Wallace was stripped and strapped to a wooden frame. He was then tied to horses and dragged across the city's roads, his skin scraping against stone. Blood marked his passage like a gruesome trail. The crowd cheered, threw refuse, shouted curses. This wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. The authorities wanted his humiliation to be total. By the time he reached Smithfield, the place chosen for his execution, his body was battered, torn, but alive. A scaffold awaited him. The crowd was even denser now. Some had travelled from other counties just to witness what they believed would be a once-in-a-lifetime display. The executioner, a man practised in this dark profession, began his task. The noose went around Wallace's neck. He was lifted. He strangled. But before death could take him, the rope was cut. He collapsed, choking, eyes still aware. Then the knives came. With Wallace still conscious, his abdomen was opened. His organs were pulled out, each one shown to the jeering audience before being tossed into the flames. The smell of human flesh roasting mixed with the sounds of horror and awe. Still, Wallace endured. Still, his gaze remained steady. Only when the executioner decapitated him did the agony end. His head, now severed, was raised for the mob to see. The body, butchered further, was cut into 4 parts, but it wasn't over. His head was preserved in tar and displayed on London Bridge, his limbs sent to various corners of Scotland, each part nailed up in towns where rebellion might still be whispered. These gruesome relics weren't just punishment, they were propaganda. His remains became symbols, each one screaming the same message. This is what happens to those who resist. And for a moment it worked. Some Scots, shaken by the horror, gave up the fight. Others fled. The image of Wallace, broken, gutted, beheaded, was a cold warning carved in flesh. But Edward's plan didn't hold. Instead of extinguishing hope, Wallace's death ignited something deeper. The image of his agony became a spark. Robert the Bruce, once hesitant, now pressed forward. Others followed. The brutality had backfired. Wallace had been silenced, but not defeated. His death had turned him into something more than a man. He became a memory too powerful to destroy. In the days that followed William Wallace's death, the streets of London returned to their usual rhythm. But beneath the surface, the memory of what had transpired at Smithfield lingered like smoke that never quite cleared. The charred remains of his organs, the blood-stained cobbles, The silent horror of the crowd, those things left a scar on more than the pavement. They imprinted themselves in minds, in stories, in whispered warnings passed through generations. King Edward believed he had won. In his eyes, Wallace's dismemberment was a triumph, a definitive silencing of the man who had dared to stand against English dominion. He imagined he had severed the head of rebellion itself. With Wallace gone, Edward expected compliance. He expected Scotland to kneel for good. But history rarely plays out as tyrants hope. What followed Wallace's death was not the quieting of unrest, but its transformation. His gruesome end didn't snuff out resistance, it evolved it. Wallace, in death, became something untouchable. His body had been butchered, yes, but his spirit had passed into myth, into every dark tale told in hushed tones, into every heart still burning for freedom. The very horror meant to break Scottish will had instead solidified it. Robert the Bruce, who had walked the line between ambition and caution, took note. He had once sworn loyalty to Edward, a political move more than anything. But Wallace's execution shifted his calculus. It revealed, in cruel clarity, what submission truly looked like, not peace, but shame and obliteration. In Wallace's agony, Bruce saw the stakes, saw that compromise was no refuge. So he picked up where Wallace left off. He raised arms not just for power or land, but because he now knew what surrender truly cost. The war that Wallace had started, imperfect, chaotic, and desperate, would burn anew under Bruce's command. And it wouldn't just be a fight of swords and soldiers, it would be a war of memory. Wallace's execution had created a cultural scar so vivid that it reshaped how war was waged. Captured fighters began to resist surrender with new intensity. They had seen, or heard of, what happened to Wallace. There would be no leniency, no honour in chains. Death on the battlefield became preferable to being dragged behind horses and gutted like livestock in front of jeering crowds. Scottish resistance adopted this hardened edge. Battles became bloodier, more merciless. The idea of no quarter wasn't just a tactic, it was a code. Warriors fought not only for survival but for vengeance. Wallace's fate haunted them, not just as a warning, but as a reason to keep going. And beyond Scotland's hills, beyond the reach of English patrols, other nations watched. In France, in the Holy Roman Empire and across the Catholic world, nobles and rulers took notice of England's response to rebellion. They saw Wallace's execution not merely as punishment, but as a terrifying display of unchecked authority. The message was clear: challenge the crown, and your body would be used as a bulletin board. But that message didn't intimidate everyone. For some, it confirmed fears about English ambition and cruelty. England gained a reputation not just as a military power, but as a brutal regime. This perception would later colour diplomatic negotiations, isolate the English court, and stir resentment in places far removed from the Scottish Highlands. The execution wasn't just a national trauma, it was a diplomatic incident dressed in blood. What's perhaps most chilling about Wallace's death is how meticulously it was documented. Chronicles, legal records, eyewitness testimonies, all recorded with a kind of cold precision. From the route of his dragging through London to the sequence of his disembowelment, nearly every moment was preserved. These weren't mere afterthoughts, they were deliberate entries into the public record meant to endure. One such account came from the Lanercost Chronicle, written by English monks. Their tone was detached, clinical. They described the crowd, the length of the torture, the executioner's tasks. It reads less like a religious text and more like a manual, pain catalogued step by step. And in that dispassion, something grotesque becomes clear. Wallace's death wasn't just allowed, it was orchestrated. It was engineered suffering, state-endorsed and publicly performed. Other accounts, especially those preserved in Scotland, read very differently. John of Fordun, a chronicler writing decades later, painted Wallace as a stoic martyr. His descriptions border on the mythical. Wallace silent, eyes forward, spirit unbroken. While these details might blur with legend, they reflect something deeply real. The emotional impact of his story. In Scotland, Wallace wasn't remembered as a criminal. He was remembered as a man who stood his ground until the bitter, bloody end. In that contrast, the English precision and the Scottish passion, you can see the two nations' psyches laid bare. One sought to dominate the record, the other sought to protect the soul. Even the legal documents from Wallace's trial still exist. Preserved in England's National Archives, they list every charge, every procedural step, every sentence handed down. They confirm that the entire event, from the mock trial to the mutilation, wasn't chaotic or improvised. It was structured, like an evil ritual made of ink and bureaucracy, every step approved, every cruelty sanctioned. Eyewitnesses add further texture. Some describe Wallace's silence. Others claim he tried to speak in his final moments, though the words were lost to the wind. One observer recalled the sheer number of people packed into Smithfield, elbow to elbow, waiting not for justice but for a show. Another noted how Wallace's eyes remained open through the ordeal, staring not at the crowd but past them, towards something else. And so his story grew. His death had not ended the movement. It had fertilized it. Wallace, now more legend than man, became a national spirit, impossible to imprison, impossible to kill again. Generations later, his legacy would fuel revolts, inspire poets, shape policy, and ultimately influence the very foundations of law. His treatment, a grotesque parody of justice, was one of many medieval atrocities that would, centuries later, help shape emerging ideas about rights, dignity, and humane punishment. As the Enlightenment unfolded and new schools of thought began to question the divine right of kings, scholars pointed to Wallace as a victim of judicial barbarism. They argued that even enemies of the state deserved some fundamental protections. Wallace, in this context, became not just a symbol of freedom for one country, but an early case study in the rights of the individual against unchecked authority. The arts seized upon his story. Ballads passed from voice to voice, songs filled taverns, portraits were painted not from life, but from collective imagination. He appeared in plays, poems, and later in books and films. Each generation reinterpreted his sacrifice through their own lens. In the 19th century, amid surges of nationalism, he was embraced as a foundational figure. In the 20th, filmmakers moulded him into a populist icon. Each time his death served a new purpose, but the core never changed. He stood for the refusal to bend. Wallace's execution also redefined what national trauma looked like. It wasn't just the loss of a hero, it was the psychological weight of his suffering. That pain became shared memory. It became fuel, and for Scotland, it became proof that resistance could outlive the body. The punishment chosen, hanging, drawing, quartering, wasn't just about severity. It was about messaging. Reserved only for traitors, it conveyed absolute betrayal of crown and country. By using it on Wallace, Edward was declaring that Wallace, and by extension all of Scotland, had no right to self-rule, that they were already his subjects, whether they agreed or not. This was legal theatre of the cruelest kind. It was about shaping perception as much as dispensing pain. Justice, in that era, was a ritual. Spectacle wasn't a byproduct. It was the whole point. When Wallace's entrails were flung into the flames, when his limbs were nailed to city gates, those acts were designed not just to destroy a man, but to script a message into the walls of history. And that message, ironically, failed. Because Edward's greatest mistake wasn't in killing Wallace, it was in making him unforgettable. The king had intended to erase a rebellion. Instead, he had created a symbol. He'd offered the world a vision not of authority, but of cruelty. And cruelty, no matter how thoroughly performed, cannot inspire loyalty. Even centuries later, the story of Wallace's death invites a hard question. How can civilization tolerate such orchestrated horror? The crowds that watched him suffer weren't sociopaths. They were citizens, farmers, tradesmen, children. They had been conditioned by power, by fear, by tradition, to believe that such violence was not only acceptable but necessary. This is perhaps the most disturbing truth, that violence, when wrapped in the language of law and authority, becomes not only possible, but normalized. The executioners followed protocol. The magistrates cited precedent. The witnesses bought bread and watched the show, and the wheels of state turned smoothly, lubricated by blood. It wasn't just Wallace who was on trial, it was the very idea of resistance. And in that contest, Wallace, silent, bound, and torn apart, won. Not by defeating armies, but by refusing to submit, by suffering without surrender, by becoming a ghost too loud to silence. Time moved on, seasons shifted, kings came and went, but William Wallace, though long dead, remained ever present, not in flesh but in memory, in resistance, in rage that refused to fade. His name outlasted the stone that bore his blood and the scaffold where he breathed his last. Even as England tightened its grip on the British Isles, the story of Wallace whispered through the glens of Scotland like smoke that refused to clear. The gruesome spectacle of his execution didn't erase him. It etched him deeper into the soul of a nation. Every brutal detail of that day, meant to terrorize, did something else entirely. It made Wallace immortal. The way he died gave his cause a permanence that no sword ever could. He became a symbol that defied decay. In the generations that followed, Wallace's legacy twisted its way into every crevice of Scottish identity. His image was carved into stone, painted onto walls, sung about in taverns and battlefields alike. Parents told their children the tale of the man who stood when others bowed. And though those children grew old and faded into history themselves, the story remained, sharp, raw, untamed. That's what Edward failed to understand. He had wanted to make Wallace an example, an emblem of what happened to those who resisted English authority. He succeeded, but not in the way he intended. Wallace became the example not of defeat, but of conviction, of a person who stood their ground, even as the world around them demanded surrender. His very destruction proved that he could not be controlled. The legacy left behind wasn't just poetic or emotional, it shaped policy, warfare, and ideology. Robert the Bruce, deeply influenced by Wallace's stand, would go on to lead Scotland to a level of autonomy never thought possible in the years after Wallace's death. At Bannockburn, Bruce's army broke English forces in a decisive clash, proving that the seed Wallace had planted could bloom in battle. But the impact wasn't only military. Wallace's death began to reshape what people believed justice should look like. In the centuries to come, as philosophers and revolutionaries rethought the relationship between ruler and ruled, Wallace's story served as a cautionary tale, not about rebellion, but about cruelty wielded by the state. In the birth of modern legal systems, his case was held up as a grotesque failure of due process and humanity. He'd never been granted a fair trial. His punishment was designed not to deliver justice, but to terrorize. Over time, the legal world began to reckon with questions Wallace's death left behind. Should a nation be allowed to destroy a person for opposing it? Is resistance ever criminal when the authority in question is unjust? These questions continue to echo through courtrooms and constitutions even today. Wallace's influence spilled into the arts as well. His story became fuel for centuries of creative expression. The earliest Scottish poets took to verse to honour him, sometimes blending fact with fiction to elevate his myth. Later, as nationalism surged across Europe, Wallace was held up as a model of resistance, used not just by Scots but by any people struggling under foreign rule. He was recast in different ways for different times. Sometimes he was the noble knight, sword in hand, dying with honour. Other times he was the brutal guerrilla, unpolished but unyielding. His adaptability was part of his power. Wallace was not defined by one version, he belonged to all who needed his example. In the modern era, film and literature brought him back into global consciousness. One portrayal in particular burned itself into popular culture. Although historically imperfect, it reminded the world of Wallace's raw defiance, his cry for liberty, and the price he paid for it. That cry, echoed across theatres and televisions, hit something timeless. But Wallace's real cry, the one history doesn't quite hear, is deeper. It's the cry of someone whose body was torn apart but whose principles remained untouched. It's the cry that asks, what is freedom worth? What are we willing to suffer for? That question, unanswered, still looms. Scotland, even centuries later, continues to wrestle with its own identity. Debates over independence, over self-rule, still carry Wallace's shadow. Every time the question of separation from England rises, Wallace rises with it, not as a politician, not as a policy, but as a presence, as a reminder of a fight that never quite ended. And across the world his legacy remains relevant, not because we live under monarchs with axes and scaffolds, but because power still crushes, still silences. Governments still weaponize laws, people still vanish for speaking out. The world has changed its costumes, but not always its tactics. Wallace's execution serves as a kind of eternal warning that cruelty can be cloaked in process, that injustice can wear the face of law, and that the crowd can be turned into an accomplice when power demands it. But it also offers something else, a rare kind of hope, that even in the hands of death truth can survive, that even when your voice is cut off, your silence can roar. The psychological toll of Wallace's fate didn't just shape those who came after, it reshaped the past. His death forced Scotland to reframe its own story. He wasn't just a fighter who lost, he was a mirror, showing what people were willing to become to keep others beneath them. And in that reflection, something changed. Dignity stripped from his body was not stripped from his memory. His final moments, unspeakably violent, became the foundation for 1,000 acts of courage. The nightmare of his death turned into a kind of shared reckoning, a collective vow to never again allow that level of subjugation to define a people. His execution was not unique in its method. Others were hanged, drawn, and quartered before and after. But Wallace was different because of what he stood for, and because of how the world responded. He wasn't erased, he was reborn in every generation that chose to resist. His story survived not because it was told, it survived because it demanded to be remembered. And so the image of him persists, not in crowns or statues or flags, but in the feeling people get when they hear his name, the lump in the throat, the fire in the belly, the stillness that comes when thinking about someone who was pulled apart and yet never really broken. He is proof that even the most horrifying end can become the most inspiring legacy. The site of his execution, Smithfield, looks different now. It's covered in pavement, crisscrossed by modern traffic. No scaffold remains, no smoke rises from fires. But the ground remembers. History is like that. It doesn't forget, even when we pretend it might. And London Bridge, where his head once stared down at the Thames, today it carries cars and trains, oblivious to the screams it once overlooked. But if you stand quietly, you can almost feel the weight of the past pressing against the present. Wallace's limbs, scattered across Scotland, are long gone. The wooden spikes rotted, the bones vanished into soil. But where his body was divided, his influence remained whole. Each city that once held a piece of him eventually claimed all of him. His presence became national, not in blood, but in belief. In the end, William Wallace was not defeated. He was transformed. From a hunted rebel to a political martyr, from a tortured prisoner to a timeless emblem of resistance. His name survived the centuries not because he wanted glory, but because he dared to challenge it. He dared to imagine a different future, and though he never lived to see it, he laid its foundation in suffering few can even imagine. Today, when people speak of freedom, when they rise against oppression, when they challenge injustice with nothing but principle to stand on, they're walking a road Wallace helped pave. A road marked not just by victories, but by losses that mattered more. He reminds us that freedom isn't clean. It's often paid for in screams, in wounds, in betrayals. It's fought not only in battles, but in courtrooms, in prisons, in quiet moments of defiance. He shows us that resistance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the way someone refuses to bow, even as the axe is being raised. So when we talk about heroes, we shouldn't only think of those who won. We should think of those who refused to give in. Wallace was one of those rare figures whose death did not end his influence. It amplified it. He was silenced, but his silence turned into thunder. His mutilation became a symbol. His suffering became a story that refuses to die. Because somewhere deep in the bones of Scotland and in the hearts of those who still value freedom over comfort, William Wallace still walks. Not as a ghost, not as a statue, but as a reminder that some things are worth any price, and that even when your body breaks, your spirit can rise.